Welcome back to MVM. Today we have a Kickstarter preview. This is for a brand new game sponsored from CreativeMaker. It's called Clash of Minds, Holmes versus Moriarty, two great fictional characters. We are playing a two-player game, and that's what it is. Two people up against each other. It is a symmetric game, but it has asymmetrical goals.
Yeah, absolutely. You're doing the same sorts of things using the same sorts of cards. However, Moriarty is trying to commit a crime, and Holmes is trying to solve that crime.
Yeah, so this is a deduction game mixed with a bluffing game, mixed with a very, very clever hand management game, because you're trying to do all those things at once, and you're playing multiple rounds trying to do one of two different things. As Moriarty, you're trying to not let 3 threads of evidence get resolved before the clock strikes 12.
Yeah, and of course, as Holmes, you're trying to reveal those 3 threads as well. You're going to have a weapon, you're going to have a person who's typically the victim, and then you're going to have the crime itself, the type of crime you're trying to solve.
Also, you're going to have an investigation site. This is going to do a couple different things in the game, but it's going to give a global effect to all the characters at that given time. Now, we mentioned 3 threads of evidence. That's because there's 3 columns or 3 lanes in which players are going to be using their cards in order to enact very specific actions in the game, trying to either protect them as Moriarty or investigate them as Sherlock.
Yeah, your cards play a few different roles. Like Jeremy just said, a lot of them are going to have powers. We kind of have a game set up here. Cards will be revealed as you play, but the cards are going to serve 2 purposes. One, the cards all have various powers that you might be able to use. But one thing that almost all of the cards have is some sort of influence value that's going to calculate who wins each column effectively each round. It's a bit of a tug of war with that influence.
Now, one thing we should mention, there are multiple for each of these different threads, so each time you play the game, it's going to be vastly different from one game to the next. The other thing we need to mention, as Moriarty, I'm going to know what these 3 things are. So I'm going to look at each of them and read the text, because there's particular ones that are good for me to have him reveal if he does reveal them, and there's very bad ones for me if he does reveal, and then there's one that's simply neutral. So I'm going to look at all these and kind of make my strategy around those particular threads of evidence.
Yeah, that's the first thing that really makes the mind game start, because once Moriarty looks at those cards and puts them down, and cards start getting played, Holmes starts thinking, well, is Moriarty placing cards there because that's what he wants to protect, or is he sort of doing a double reverse bluff on me?
Now, before we start talking about how to play the game, we need to talk about the 3 types of cards in the game. The very first thing are your influence cards. Each of us has a stack of 20 cards that are symmetric. They all have the same cards in our hand. However, there's a different number of each of them, and they all have different powers. One thing you should know about all the cards, though, is that they have a strength in the upper right-hand corner. They have an ability, which usually when you use that card is going to tap that card. It's still going to remain in that thread, but it's going to have a different power. It could go up, it could go down, depending upon that power that you use.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, those powers are powerful. You're going to want to use them, but the cost is typically that you're going to lose influence. Now, there are some cards that actually gain influence because those cards work in a unique way. The other type of card you're going to be using, a lot of, are the action cards. Each player is going to have 4 of these action cards. They're going to come into play midway through the game of each round, and you're going to use those to actually sort of enact actions within each of the columns.
And the final type of card are the agents. Now, each of us has a asymmetric stack of agents. These are 4 cards, and you're going to shuffle those up at the beginning and put them face down in front of you. You're going to draw one of those during the very first round that you could bring into play. These are things that are going to change the way that you could possibly score each of these threads of evidence if you are able to bring them into play.
So the beginning of each round is going to start the same way. Every round is going to have effectively 3 different phases. And the first phase is the start of the investigation. This is going to start the same way every time. You're going to flip over a new investigation site, and it's going to have a few things to talk about. The first thing right here is how many hours are going to click away on the clock. So you're instantly going to move the clock that far. Moriarty is going to be able to do that as well, but this investigation site is going to do that also. The next thing is this number of cards down here. As you play cards out into the board, once you reach this limit on your side, that's going to be one way to trigger the end of the round to move on to the next round. And then finally, there's going to be a power, which Jeremy mentioned earlier. This is going to have sort of an ongoing effect or an immediate impact on the round itself.
The next 2 steps are very simple. The first one is called initiating contact. You're simply going to draw 5 cards into your hand. And then the next thing after that is you're going to draw the top card from your agent stack. You're going to look at that card, and place it face down in front of you off to the side. It's going to have a number on it. That number is the number of cards that you have to basically play underneath of it in order to use that card. And again, these agents have multiple different powers that you can use and various different influences they're going to have on the game itself.
Yeah, and then you start getting into the actual play. Now, the beginning of every round is going to start with this period where each player seeds the board with 3 cards. We've already done that. We've kind of set up a game midway through. But you're going to look at your cards, and then one at a time, the first player is going to play 1 card face down in one of the lanes, followed by the other player, back and forth until there's 3 cards, at which point all 3 of those cards are revealed.
Now, as we mentioned, we already have a game in progress, and we have some sideways cards here. We'll talk about why we have cards. These are basically left over from previous rounds, and they'll always stay in play. And then each of the players in turn order is going to play their action cards out in front of them, taking the actions associated with those cards. You can take as many as you want. However, one of the cards is obligatory or mandatory. You have to use this card each of the rounds when it comes to you. The other 3 cards are optional. It's up to you and whether or not you wish to use them. As you're going to notice, this has a particular action, while these are dual, meaning you can pick the top or the bottom portion of these actions. They all have different effects. This one is going to allow you to take one of your cards, one of those influence cards that you've already played, and to place it face up in one of your rows, basically adding additional cards to that section. These actions here are going to allow you to draw additional cards into your hand. These are going to allow you to tap your cards, basically using the action of that card. And as we mentioned, using that card is going to have various different influences on the game board, plus it could change the value or the strength of that particular character or card in that thread.
Yeah, moving the cards around is a big part of the game, and when you do this, you're going to be able to mostly do that with the powers on your cards. Some of them will allow you to move certain cards, some of them will be cards in your lane, but they can often be either your cards or your opponent's cards. So it's a bit of a shell game, and again, more of those mind games trying to get your opponent to figure out where you're trying to get the most influence for that round.
The final possible action that you could take are these actions here, and these are called support. This is taking one of your cards from your hand and placing it sideways into any one of the 3 threads. As you can see, we have cards already in these locations. Now, the good thing about this is they're going to constantly add 1 power per card in each of those threads. The bad thing is you're giving up that card permanently for the game. There's very few ways to get these cards back, but you're basically laying it down, adding that support, and it's the only type of card that's going to stay in that thread from round to round.
Yeah, you're going to want to have some of those support cards out there because over the course of the game, you're going to want to chip away at that influence goal to try to get what you want to happen. We haven't talked about that much, but like we said earlier, Moriarty is trying to protect these and Holmes is trying to reveal them. The influence is going to do that. So all the influence you can have in a column, the better.
Now, you're going to keep doing this until the end of the round conditions are met. This is called the final turn, and that is going to trigger when an X number of face-up cards have been played in front of one of the 2 characters. In this instance, it's determined by the sight, as always, and that's 6 cards. So the moment that I have 6 cards face up in front of any part of my side, that's going to trigger the final turn, in which the other player gets to do 1 more turn.
Yeah, and the other way that you could trigger the end of the round is if both players have no more influence cards in their hand and they have to take that obligatory play card action and can't actually do it.
Once that is done, you're going to go into a final turn. Now, this is very interesting. Those 4 action cards that we already showed you, each player is going to pick those back up into their hand, and starting with the first player, they're going to place one of these cards face down in any one of the 3 threads of evidence, followed by the next player. And you're going to go back and forth, placing one of these face down into each of these locations. Then, once all players have all 4 of their cards face down, again starting with the first player, they get to pick any one of those cards, reveal it face up, take the action, and then the next player gets to do it, and back and forth until all 4 of those cards have been revealed, introducing new cards, possibly tapping some new cards, probably throwing down more support, until that is done, and then you're actually going to score up each of those threads.
Yeah, after that final turn, you're going to look at each thread and you're going to add up the influence. Like we said, there's going to be influence values on those cards. There's going to be support cards out there that equal 1 influence. Now, this is where some of the other things come into play. The location might have an impact on this. Some of the locations cards might say all support cards are 2. And also, your agent might have an impact. I've had an agent that also made the support cards worth an extra 1 or something like that. So you're able to take all that into consideration and determine who's winning in the influence in each thread of evidence.
And the value by which you are ahead of other players in these threads of evidence will determine the outcome and how you resolve those particular locations. Without doing the math here, because it would probably be too much to do, let's just talk about what would happen if one character is ahead of the other. If you're a 1 or 2 ahead of the other character, and if that's Moriarty, you're going to move the time 1 space. So that clock tower is going to take 1 more space closer to midnight. If you are 3 or more are in this red as Moriarty, you're going to move it up twice. So it's very important as Moriarty to get those locations locked down. Now, why is it important to Holmes?
Yeah, if Holmes has more influence by 1 or 2, he's going to be able to put one of these deduction tokens out onto that thread of evidence. Now, if he has 3, he's able to flip over that evidence immediately. Now, if in a later round I have one of these deduction tokens on it and I beat him by 1 or 2 again, once I place my second deduction token, it will also flip. Once it flips, there's going to be some things that happen. Like Jeremy said earlier, these cards have different sort of effects. One of them is neutral to both players. One of them is positive for Holmes, and one of them is positive for Moriarty.
So that's where the mind games come into play. You want to try to position yourself in a way that can lock down these locations as Moriarty, but you also don't want to give away too much to the other player on which of these 3 threads are important to them. As Moriarty, you want to keep them all locked down because you want that to hit midnight. And as Holmes, you want to get those locations revealed as soon as possible. Once that is done, you're going to go into the next round.
Yeah, at that point, you're going to check for victory, and if no one's won, which generally will not happen in the first round, you're going to clear all of the influence cards off of the board. You're going to leave all of the support cards, which are the cards that you've played sideways and face down, on the board. Those are going to remain as support for future rounds. You're going to put those in your discard pile and start a new round again. You're going to do all of this over and over until when you check for those victory conditions, someone has won.
Yeah, so this is Clash of Minds, Holmes versus Moriarty, a very interesting deduction game with hand management and a lot of bluffing back and forth. If you have any questions about the game, make them in the comments below. Subscribe to us, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and everything else that we do. And we will catch you guys next time.
Bye-bye.